All right, so the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So I mentioned Stephen Douglas when we talked about the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 was one where, where nobody was happy. Stephen Douglas was a part of that, and so we're going to see that we kind of see tensions cool off a little bit for a few years, and emphasis on a few, like two or three. And then Stephen Douglas is going to start to be really eager to get a transcontinental railroad to go through Chicago. Chicago, he's from Illinois, and Chicago is this booming town, and so he wants this to change the economy there. He wants to increase his political clout. Now, Stephen Douglas is one of those people that kind of, he's not. He doesn't understand the slave owners in the South. He's not pro-slavery, but he's just more about political expediency, and he cares more about an expanding economy and Western settlement than he does anything else. And so, he's willing to fudge a little bit on slavery because he doesn't see why it's an issue. So you're going to see this idea that Southerners are getting really frustrated at the Missouri Compromise because they feel like their territory, what are they left with after Texas, right? You've got Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma at this point is, for Indians, so they can't go into Oklahoma. So where are they going to go, right? And so the Southerners are pretty resentful of this, and they've been wanting for some time, really since about 1820, to overturn the Missouri Compromise. And so they see this pressure with the Transcontinental Railroad as a way to get this done. And so Stephen Douglas will introduce this idea of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That's because these areas are approaching enough settlement that they will soon be coming up for statehood. And so rather than worry about, the Missouri Compromise of one slave state, one free state, let's just let people decide for themselves. And this idea kind of emerged with the Compromise of 1850 because those territories of New Mexico and Utah, etc., would be allowed to decide for themselves, right? Of course, as I said, how many people are living there. And Utah had Mormon settlers, and they didn't have slaves. So you've got, there wasn't, while that seemed like a great idea, right, those particular areas were very unique in the way that slavery would not be an issue for them. Well, that's going to be very different with Kansas. So he introduces the Kansas-Nebraska Act that will allow popular sovereignty and let the territories decide for slavery on themselves. This essentially undoes the Missouri Compromise. And, of course, part of why he's doing that is he wants to encourage settlement of these territories so that he can justify putting the Transcontinental Railroad through Chicago. And I'm sure there's some backdoor dealing going on with Southerners saying, hey, if you'll support the railroad through Illinois, I'll support this, and that kind of thing. So your classic, what we would call pork barreling, right? Making the policy suit your home state, even at the expense of national interest, which, of course, if you think back to Federalist 10 and Madison, would be the exact opposite of what they would want. And so what you're going to see is that settlers stream in. First, you get a bunch of anti-slavery people that start planning to pack up and move there. And then pro-slavery people get wind of it, and they start sending people into there. And so there becomes this massive land rush into Kansas in order to shape the vote there. And so this act, this compromise by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, this is really the big thing that kills off the Whig Party. It was bad enough that Winfield Scott had come out in favor of the Compromise of 1850. And then the Whigs turn around and do this. And again, it was a horrible piece of legislation because the first off, the Compromise of 1850 is horrible, and then second off, the places that the Compromise of 1850 says can have popular sovereignty are not places where that's an issue, where slavery is going to really exist, because you're not going to have cotton production in New Mexico. And so you have this kind of happening, destroys the Whig Party. Stephen Douglas never really regains his political clout. The famous Lincoln-Douglas debates will happen about this time, shortly after this. Douglas will run for president in 1860, but he's very tainted by this Kansas-Nebraska Act. And so what will happen here is this will lead to massive violence because you'll have this huge, influx of people into there. So this is going to take us into Bleeding Kansas. So you get a bunch of what they call border ruffians. These are like rough and tumble kind of Southerners, pro-slavery guys that just kind of come into Kansas temporarily, kind of set up temporary shelters or whatever, and then basically mess up the vote. I mean, this is literally a rigged election, if you want the honest truth. And so they passed this thing called the Lecompton Constitution, and Lecompton, Kansas, was known as the capital of the pro-slavery forces, right? And so they vote, oh yes, Kansas is going to be a slave state. You have an alternative government set up in Topeka, Kansas, which is still the capital, and that's the anti-slavery government. So you have two competing constitutions, with the anti-slavery people saying that the Lecompton Constitution is the result of a rigged election, and the pro-slavery people saying the Topeka government is illegitimate. So we've got all this kind of chaos going on. Okay, and this is going to result in some violence. You've got the burning of Lawrence, Kansas, which Lawrence was an abolitionist town that had been established from the get-go by anti-slavery forces. It gets destroyed by some of these border ruffians. Senator Charles Sumner, who is from Massachusetts, I believe, insults a congressman, a senator from South Carolina, insults a relative of his. I believe it was John C. Calhoun. He actually kind of made a joke to. And this South Carolina senator literally beats up Charles Sumner in the Senate. Okay? Matter of fact, this is the picture from that. Okay? Beats him up in the Senate. Beats him with his cane so badly that Charles Sumner is permanently injured. He never fully recovers. It takes him like years before he can actually walk and talk again. So this is not just, oh, I'm going to punch you in the face once. This is a full-on physical assault bordering on murder, okay, happening in the floor of the Senate. So, when we think our politics are nasty, right? So the beating of Charles Sumner, really appalls everybody. I mean, and you can imagine why it would. I mean, most moderate thinking people would be, oh, I can't believe our senators acted that way. Of course, in the southern states, they actually sell pieces of the cane that was used to beat Charles Sumner, and they would sell them as souvenirs, right? It was a big thing. It was like a big Christmas gift that year. I mean, it's just crazy, the level of partisanship that begins to happen around 1854 is just ridiculous. So anyway, so you have Bleeding Kansas, you got Charles Sumner being beaten up in the Senate, you've got Lawrence, James Brown, not the singer. I said James Brown. It's John Brown. Oh my gosh, what was I thinking when I did this? Clearly I was losing my mind. James Brown is the singer. This is John Brown, right? The abolitionist. Gee whiz. Oh, brilliant. Anyway, see, even I make mistakes. So John Brown, at least I caught it now, right? So John Brown is this radical abolitionist. In fact, his sanity has been questioned by many historians. That's a whole nother historiographical discussion we can have about psychoanalyzing historical figures. But he clearly is not your just ordinary guy. So he really believes that he's on a mission from God to end slavery in the United States. And so when this whole Kansas-Nebraska Act comes up, he's one of these guys that essentially gets together some funds, gets some backing, takes some guns and Bibles into Kansas to kind of help defend abolitionist people from these pro-slavery forces. When Lawrence, Kansas gets burned, he decides to take revenge and attack a group of people that are settled by Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas. This is called the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. And he kills 5 men, actually hacks them to pieces, if you want the honest truth. So this isn't just, I'm going to shoot you, bang, bang, you're dead. I mean, like, he hacks them to pieces. In fact, there's trial manuscripts of the women that weren't harmed, but the women who witnessed what happened to the men. And it's horrific, right? I mean, he's clearly Yeah, I mean it's just really kind of interesting. So John Brown gets his start with Bleeding Kansas, and of course he's a whole interesting story. I kind of toyed around with us maybe doing a reading in class over John Brown and having a conversation about whether or not he was crazy. Um, I'm going to think about that, but we might do that. But so yeah, he's definitely not. I mean, people saw him as as a leader. I mean, you have groups of people that really believe what he's doing. This is how bad the issue has gotten. Is that somebody like John Brown, who's clearly advocating violence in this fight against slavery, is being endorsed and supported by other people. Okay, so lots of violence going on in Kansas. This is where we get the name Bleeding Kansas from. And so this is the result of popular sovereignty. So if we're talking about key ideas, Kansas-Nebraska Act, popular sovereignty, Bleeding Kansas. These three things are kind of tangled up together. Remember that popular sovereignty comes from the Compromise of 1850 and where all that comes from. And so you're going to see that Kansas, of course, proves that you can't just let people decide for themselves, that the divisions have become too definite. And at this point, we're about 5 or 6 years from the Civil War. Anti-slavery forces will finally succeed in getting their constitution adopted by Congress. In fact, this will be one of the things that will make Southerners think that the federal government's turning against them because they do accept the anti-slavery constitution. So this is one of the issues with Kansas. And what happens there. So Kansas will be a free state under this popular sovereignty. Again, propaganda. You can tell from looking at this picture right here that this is a abolitionist, depiction. Clearly, they're siding with Charles Sumner. He's defending himself with a pen, and it's very sarcastic Southern chivalry, and he's being beaten up. But it was pretty horrific. I mean, people were truly horrified by it, except for your really far extreme pro-slavery people. And so there's going to be lots of chaos and propaganda. And again, all of this is dividing the country even more. So this is going to get us to 1856. The northern people up north are not happy with anybody. Democrats will embrace James Buchanan. He's from Pennsylvania, but he's very friendly with Southern politics and Southern ideas, so he's okay with slavery. Side note, there's been some suggestion by some historians, and I will not testify to the veracity of this, but I do think it's kind of your interesting TMZ history, that James Buchanan was suspected as perhaps having been homosexual. Not that that's really neither here nor there. It's just kind of an interesting side story. It's hard to say because the standards of the 19th century were very different than the standards of today. He clearly had a very intense and close friendship relationship with another man. To what degree that was actually a love relationship, I don't know. He definitely had a housekeeper that was incredibly loyal to him and basically lived with him for most of his life. So what that was about, I don't know. Technically, he's a bachelor. So it's just kind of an interesting little TMZ moment. I just thought I'd throw that in there. To let you know that, this kind of drama doesn't just exist in 2016. It exists in 1856, too. So you have Buchanan being kind of one of these hybrid candidates that's meant to attract a lot of different people. You get a new party, again, the emphasis of populism. The Republicans, and these are the Republicans that are the basis for what is now the Republican Party. They are led by John Fremont from California. Abraham Lincoln campaigned for Fremont. The Republicans are very much against slavery expansion, and they are embracing free soilers that had fractured off from the Democratic Party. You have an American Party that embraces Millard Fillmore, who didn't do very much. The American Party will be known as the Know-Nothings. And the Know-Nothings are a group of people that are nativists. They're opposed to immigration, particularly Catholic immigration, any Germans or Irish that emerge. And so I think that it's really interesting to point out that you have a nativist organization that campaigns like that. And they were pro-market, right? But they wanted to pay special attention to artisans. The idea was that we could have a market economy, that if we didn't have immigrants, that there would be more than enough jobs for Americans, and that the American males that are getting squeezed in the market economy wouldn't be squeezed anymore. So it was all the fault of immigrants. The Know-Nothings campaign, with the idea that their meetings were highly secret. And so they're very much, they're a little bit of a fringe group. They're not serious contenders for the presidency. They are serious contenders in some state elections. Again, the idea of small republic kind of gains traction there. But they're going to run a candidate, and you're going to have the Democrats as well. Of course, keep in mind that the Democrats had already shut off their free soilers that are now part of the Republican Party. And so another three-party election. The American Party, the Know-Nothings, they're not strong enough to really produce a three-party effect. You don't have a clear majority for anybody. Buchanan will win the Electoral College. Lots of accusations of a rigged election. Again, not kidding about that. So we did have that coming out. Again, you thought it was just 2016. So the election of 1856 is messy, incredibly, incredibly messy. What you'll see after the election of 1856 is a real rise in what we call nativism. And nativism is a term you need to take with you. Nativism is this idea that anyone who is American-born is superior, that being a native-born American, not Native American, but native-born American, is superior to anybody else. They tend to embrace a lot of racial and ethnic stereotypes. So they're opposed to free blacks. They're opposed to the Irish. They're opposed to Germans, to say nothing of being opposed to Chinese. So these are going to be the ones that will gain traction in places like New York, for instance, and even to some extent in Ohio. So it's not that they're pro-slavery, because they're not. In fact, they oppose slavery in Western expansion because they see that as disadvantaging your average white male, white American-born male. But they are definitely going to be racist. They're definitely going to be opposed to other groups. Very anti-Catholic, lots of anti-Catholic sentiment. And I think in the 21st century, we've forgotten what a big deal that is. But it used to be a really big deal. Being Catholic was to the 1800s, and it was talked about in the 1800s the way you hear people talk about Islam and being Muslim today. So again, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So the United States has always struggled with this kind of thing. This nativism is going to embrace temperance. Temperance is the idea that we encourage, or rather discourage, consumption of alcohol. It's not full-on prohibition necessarily. That's a 20th century development, but it is definitely the idea that you encourage people not to drink. Think very much like an anti-smoking campaign, if you will. And so the Know-Nothings are going to have some degree of influence, some degree of power. I do have a video, and I don't know if I'll show it in class or maybe I'll link it here. I'm not sure. So look for a hyperlink, or for me to share it or something. But the Know-Nothings will eventually, they will eventually kind of linger, maybe not as a full-blown political party, but certainly as elements in both political parties. This idea of kind of that anti-immigrant feeling. So the Know-Nothings have some political power, particularly at local elections and state elections, and have some power in Congress, particularly the House. But they're not going to have the position of president, for instance. And this kind of I did link the video. Never mind. So if you're you're interested in hearing a little bit more about the Know Nothings, you can click on this hyperlink right here, and it'll show you the video. And it's kind of an interesting snippet. I don't think it's very long. Matter of fact, what is it? I don't know. You can click on it and see. And then this is a poster from the Know Nothings, and of course they had a whole secret handshake and all that kind of stuff. So one of the issues that happens in Buchanan's presidency. So Buchanan's presidency is not known for its high points. It is known for some key points, but not for high points. Dred Scott decision. So you have under Buchanan a slave named Dred Scott, whose owner moved from Missouri into Illinois for a little while, lived in the Wisconsin territory, then moves back to Missouri with his master. Once he moves back to Missouri, he will then sue in court saying, hey, I should be free. I've spent so much time in Illinois and Wisconsin that means I basically earned my freedom because he had been taken out of Missouri. Of course, keep in mind, you have the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act. So that Fugitive Slave Act would have made it so that they could have gone and reclaimed him. So this is one of the reasons. So on it, if you don't think about it, you'll be, why didn't he just leave if he was free? Well, because of the Fugitive Slave Act. He couldn't just leave without risking being captured and then worse things happening. So he sues in court, and this makes it all the way to the Supreme Court. And this is one of the worst decisions that the Supreme Court ever made. Justice Taney, and Taney, I'm trying to remember, there's another decision he's involved in that's pretty awful, and it's escaping me at the moment. But so Taney's not your best Supreme Court justice. He's going to he signs the majority ruling that says Dred Scott is a slave because he didn't sue until after he returned to Missouri, so it's a moot point. So if he wanted to be free, if he wanted to have a chance to be free, he should have sued in Illinois, right? However, he goes on to say that the Missouri Compromise itself is unconstitutional. So we'd already had the Kansas-Nebraska Act that kind of tried the idea of popular sovereignty with Kansas and Nebraska. It doesn't fully undo the Missouri Compromise in the sense that it doesn't take it off the table for other territories. It only took it off the table for Kansas and Nebraska. But with the Dred Scott decision, this is 1857, you're going to see that the Supreme Court is going to say that the Missouri Compromise is flat out unconstitutional, that the federal government can't tell states, can't tell people what they can do with their property. You can't tell slave owners they can't move someplace because they have slaves, if they're property, right? Slaveholders can take their slaves anywhere. And so the important concept under Buchanan's administration is that slavery now becomes the law of the land. And this is in 1857. So again, we've seen beginning with the Wilmot Proviso in 1846, this increasing destruction of this compromise system that had kind of held the country together. It's made worse by the Compromise of 1850. It's made worse by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And now a nail is finally put in the coffin with the Dred Scott decision. Now there is no middle ground. There is no compromise that you can fall back to. You can't go back to the Missouri Compromise because it's now been declared unconstitutional. So that means we're right back where we were in 1820. Do we want slave states or free states? And how is that going to work? So, of course, this is a major victory for for pro-slavery forces, or even for people like Stephen Douglas, who just don't see slavery as an issue, even though they don't personally own slaves. You're also going to see that abolitionists, this is going to really radicalize anybody who is remotely anti-slavery. So somebody like Abraham Lincoln is really going to be pushed to the other side because of this. Not long after the Dred Scott decision, in fact, good old John Brown, I spelled it right this time, is going to take the motivation from the Dred Scott decision, just like we saw him react to the burning of Lawrence, Kansas with the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. We're going to see him react to the Dred Scott decision with Harper's Ferry. John Brown, again, radical abolitionist. He thinks if he goes down into the South and begins a slave uprising, that the slaves will rise up. And of course, he has places where he talks about cleansing the nation with blood. So he is intending for it to be violent, and make no mistake about that. That's one of the complicated factors with John Brown. He's violently opposed to slavery. And many people at this point are beginning to be radically opposed to slavery. And yet he's also talking about cleansing the United States of the sin of slavery through the shedding of blood. So he marches through, seizes the armory at Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry, Virginia is a beautiful area, by the way. Gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous. If you ever are through there, I recommend you stopping. Somewhere I have pictures, but anyways, you have him seizing the armory and instigating this action there. However, the slaves in the area do not rise up. First off, keep in mind this is Virginia, right? So Virginia had a very different slave system than, say, South Carolina or Georgia or even Texas. And plus these are slaves that had seen they remember what happened after Nat Turner, right? And after Nat Turner's uprising, things got way worse. And it was just starting to maybe ease up a little bit. So they're not about to go starting a slave uprising, especially one that seems a little bit half-baked, and FYI, it really was. It was not well planned. He and his sons take over this armory. A couple of them get killed. You're going to see Robert E. Lee. He's actually the military, and I don't remember what his rank was at the time. Maybe sergeant, corporal, something like that. Major, I don't know. He captures John Brown, arrests him. And what's going to happen is that Northerners, even those who don't believe in the violence that John Brown was talking about, they're going to feel like the circumstances of the politics have become so bad that they almost turned a blind eye to what's going on. I don't agree with him, but, I agree the situation's bad. So, I wouldn't do that. But, so you have a whole lot of that going on from the North. And you even have some that see him as a martyr. Some of the transcendentalists that we'll talk about see him as a martyr. And so there's lots of complicated legacy from John Brown. The Southerners are going to see this as an example of, abolition. They're going to see this is what they're trying to do. They want to kill us all in our beds. It's going to encourage more fear and loathing. And again, you've seen this whole trend emerging where these two sides are really kind of fractured from each other. With the North sitting up there feeling like the Southerners are in control and that they won't listen to reason. You have some that are thinking that, it's the wealthy planters. They don't listen to reason. If we could just communicate with everybody else without understanding the complex social system of the South and how you have, people without property and even slave owners that only have a few slaves that are struggling, how they're bought into the system too. And the Northerners and the abolitionists just don't get it. And the South is going to continue to feel like the North doesn't understand them, nor do they want to, or understand their concerns, because clearly they wouldn't have, somewhat agreed with John Brown. And then, so this just, again, hardens the division. So if you're going from, the Dred Scott decision, this is going to be the next thing. This is the next result that comes from this amount of regionalization, these hard lines that are emerging, and indeed this series of events that really goes back, one could argue to the Missouri Compromise, but certainly back to Texas. And Texas wanting to come in, and what that does as far as Western expansion. And of course, ultimately, all of this is due to the market economy, the demands that the factories have on cotton, this emerging global system of trade that we've got, lots of factors like that. So there's a lot going on here. So the 20 years of dysfunction, again, lots of trouble for the American Indians. Their territories are under have been challenged. We'll start to see very quickly by the time you get to 1860, having violence. If you've been following the Standing Rock Reservation, there was the Laramie, the Treaty of Fort Laramie that I think is from oh gosh, don't quote me. Is it 47, 57, something like that? That I realize there's 10 years difference, but I'm sure it's 18 something 7. But anyways, so the Fort Laramie Treaty had established some of these guidelines about Indian territory, and what we see is that this continues to be ignored. We do have technological development. The railroads begin to be very important. They begin to grow and expand very rapidly, and that's going to be very important. We do have a frontier. Again, this whole idea of Republican democracy, small land ownership. If I can't make it in the market economy, I can pack up and move out west. But most importantly, these years of dysfunction result in the slavery issue and the division in the country, with Republicans actually emerging as the strongest party. They're in the North. They're very clearly anti-slavery. The Democrats being very pro-slavery. And you'll have some Democrats that are stationed in the North that are pro-unity. In other words, they're not pro-slavery, but they're not anti-slavery either. And so this is where we're going to kind of be until we talk about the election of 1860. So just keep in mind all of these events. You want to be sure that you understand the key ones. And this is it for the Regionalized America. I think I have the quiz on this scheduled for November 15th. So by then you need to have all these videos watched. I think that's it. So I'm going to be quiet because it's like at 31 minutes.